Welcome to Independently Speaking, the podcast from the Independent Schools Association. ISA represents head teachers across the UK, leading schools as diverse as the children in them. From small community schools to specialist providers in performing arts, outdoor education, faith, SEND, and sport. Hear from leaders sharing the challenges, opportunities, and stories shaping independent education. Here's your host, ISA Director of Education and Inclusion, Helen Stanton-Tonner.
Welcome to the ISA podcast, Independently Speaking. I am your host, Helen Stanton-Tonner, the Director of Education and Inclusion for ISA. In today's episode, we're turning our attention to a group of children whose needs are becoming increasingly visible in early years and school settings, often referred to as COVID babies. These are children whose earliest experiences of the world were shaped by lockdown, reduced social interaction, disrupted health services, and stretched early years provision. Now, for many, this has resulted in emerging needs around communication, emotional regulation, sensory processing, and development. And for some, it's also exposed how fragile and fragmented our systems of inclusion really are. Now, this episode is not about blame. It's actually about leadership. How do education leaders respond when systems lag behind children's needs? How do we lead inclusively when thresholds are rising, resources are limited, and staff are exhausted? And what does ethical, values-led leadership look like for children who risk becoming a forgotten generation? Now, I am delighted to be joined by Michelle Windridge. Michelle is an early years and SEND specialist, writer and national education lead for early years at Twinkl, whose work bridges practice, policy and advocacy. She's written extensively for organisations including Special Needs Jungle, Nursery World, Twinkl and Parenta, and is widely respected for her clear, compassionate and challenging voice on inclusion, SEND reform and early years practice. Michelle's recent article on COVID babies sparked significant discussion across the sector, not just because it articulated for many practitioners what they were seeing, but because it posed an uncomfortable leadership question. If we know this cohort needs different responses, why are systems so slow to change? Michelle, welcome to the podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Michelle, we're going to dive straight into your article on COVID babies because it resonated really quite widely. Now, from your perspective, what are leaders and practitioners noticing now that perhaps wasn't fully visible 2 or 3 years ago?
That's a great question. What many leaders are noticing is that the impact of the pandemic was never just about missed learning in the academic sense. We're seeing the long-term developmental impact of disrupted early childhood experiences becoming more visible as children move further through primary school. 2 or 3 years ago, many of these differences could still be interpreted as temporary delays or part of post-pandemic adjustment. Now, as expectations increase in Key Stage 1 and beyond, educators are seeing persistent difficulties around communication, emotional regulation, attention, social interaction, and in confidence. What's really significant is that many of these children do not necessarily present with complex or immediately identifiable SEND profiles. Instead, leaders are describing children who appear to sit in almost a grey area between developmental delay, unmet need, and emerging SEND. Schools are increasingly recognising that these children are often missed in the early warning systems, so through nursery observations, health visitor checks, baby groups, and wider social experiences that traditional support would have been identified through. I think what has become clearer is that the pandemic altered developmental contexts, not just educational access, and that really matters a lot to this generation.
And you're right, aren't you? Because you're talking about sort of them slipping. And you wrote quite powerfully about that you used the term lost, didn't you, between those systems. Now, from a leadership standpoint, where do you think those biggest disconnects currently sit? Is it sort of in general in early years? Is it the SEND identification or the school readiness? Or is it the accountability frameworks?
The disconnect sits across all of those areas, but I think perhaps the most sharply in the space between developmental reality and the expectation that we have on our children within the current system. So we continue to operate within systems that often assume children progress along a predictable pathway, yet the COVID babies, as we often call them, cohort, didn't experience a predictable early childhood. In terms of the term school readiness, it's a significant issue because it's often framed quite narrowly around compliance, routines, attainment markers, rather than the broader developmental idea of readiness for school and readiness for learning.
And there's sort of a lot of pressure, isn't there, on sort of like schools and early years leaders, and some of them are feeling quite caught between what they can see children in their care really need, but what their systems they're operating under are realistically allowing them to do. So, how do you see the role of leadership when professional judgment and policy are kind of misaligned like this?
I think leadership becomes increasingly important precisely in those moments of tension. Strong leadership is not simply about implementing policy, it's about interpreting policy through the lens of children's lived experiences. So, when professional judgment and policy feel misaligned, leaders often become that protective layer between children and systems that may not fully recognise the complexity that they're facing. That doesn't mean that ignoring statutory requirements or accountability pressures is something that we should do, but it does mean we need to be willing to advocate for approaches that are developmentally appropriate and evidence informed. I think the most effective leaders I've seen are those who create cultures where staff feel permitted to respond to need rather than constantly defending what they're doing. So they understand that inclusion is not just achieved through paperwork alone. I think we can all agree on that. It's reflected in whether educators have time to observe children properly, whether those relationships are prioritised no matter what year group the child is in, and whether staff feel trusted to adapt provision as they see fit within their classroom. I think being a leader, a head teacher I spoke to recently, he describes being a leader as being brave and having to be brave. So it does involve courage. It sometimes means holding on to that professional value and the values that are important to you as a leader, even when the external systems are quite dominant in another direction.
That is so true. It's being brave to innovate, isn't it? And
Yes.
yeah, and actually work for the benefit of those children. And you quite often challenge, don't you, this deficit-based narrative around children. And how can leaders shape school cultures so they do remain innovative, developmental, inclusive, and curious, rather than sort of rush to label or fix?
I think language really does matter. The way adults talk about children shapes the way children are understood. If schools begin from a position of what's wrong rather than what's happened or what does this child need, it becomes really easy for difference to be seen as a defect. So leaders play a central role in shaping that culture within their schools. They influence whether staff meetings focus on gaps and targets or whether they also focus on discussion around relationships, regulation, communication, and emotional well-being. They influence whether children are viewed through a strengths-based lens or a reduced lens based on interventions and what the child can't do. I think an inclusive culture is usually one that's really curious as well. So it allows educators to ask questions without immediately jumping to labels and to a diagnosis needing to be given to a child. So it values observation, it recognises that behaviour communicates something. It understands that children develop unevenly, and that support should always depend on on what the adult is seeing from the child, not necessarily from a formal diagnosis.
And those observations become even more important, don't they, in transitional periods? And you sort of you mentioned that a great deal in your work, particularly the move obviously from early years to year one, where you have a lot of expertise. So what leadership decisions most influence whether that transition supports or undermines inclusion?
I think transition is quite often one of the most underestimated leadership issues in primary education. The move from early years to year one can either protect a child's developmental needs, or it can really quickly expose them to a completely different system. So leadership decisions around curriculum design, timetable structure and pedagogy are really influential here. When year one becomes too much of a shift to formalisation, extended periods of sitting, reduced play, increased assessment pressures, many children, especially those with speech, communication or regulation difficulties, they can quickly struggle. So many times I've heard school leaders say, okay, as soon as they get to year one, we're going to hit the ground running. Of course, we need to have high expectations, but actually we need to look at what that cohort needs. And hitting the ground running doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be sitting on the carpet for 15 minutes, then sitting at a desk for 30 minutes, then back to the carpet. It means really thinking about where they've come from in reception, how they were learning, and how we can make sure that that transitions to year one and beyond. The strongest transitions often happen when leaders see year one and year two, and I've even been into schools where they've got continuous provision, a version of it in year three and beyond, and it's something that's developmental rather than, okay, we're finishing play now, you've finished reception and we're moving on to year one. Learning in year one and beyond can still be playful. It's going to look different to how it looks in reception, but it can still be playful, it can still be active. And it's really important that we maintain those play-based approaches and we prioritise communication and language, ensuring that we're collaborating with early year staff, key stage one staff, and beyond into key stage two. I think something that's done really well in early years is developing those relationships with children and with their families. And this is really important. Children transition much more successfully. We know that they do when the adults share that transition process with them. Quite often we'll have a starting school meeting for parents, we'll have settling in sessions, but then once the child's in school, those things don't happen as they transition to their new year groups. And there are lots of pressures. There are organisational pressures, time, staffing. But let's have a meet the teacher session, whether that's online or face to face. Let's continue to involve the parents with those transitions, not just when they're starting school in reception.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, that communication and involving the family and making a smooth transition from year group to year group really supports those children, doesn't it? And that's especially important at the moment, particularly with the many changes that are going on and the government's push for early identification of need within the early years, which is a very positive step. But there's also alongside that a real growing concern about rising SEN need alongside shrinking capacity for schools and early years providers to cope with it. How can leaders avoid sort of compassion fatigue, because you're dealing with children, for themselves and their teams, while really continuing to advocate for the children in their care?
That's a great question. Compassion fatigue becomes much more likely when staff feel that they are constantly absorbing need without having that capacity or the support system around them to support them. Many leaders are carrying significant emotional burdens at the moment because they can see what children need, but they're trying to navigate a system that's stretched in terms of funding, staffing pressures. It's quite often complex to navigate for leaders, for educators and for parents. I think one of the most important things leaders can do is to create a culture where staff wellbeing is really at the foundation to inclusion. It's not just an add-on. It's not just there's a box of chocolates in the staff room where everyone have a coffee and something. It's not just a one-off thing. It's not separate. Sustainable inclusion depends on emotionally supported adults. It's hard work working in education at the moment. It's really hard work. So we need to make sure that we're supporting those people that are working directly with the children. It means protecting collaboration time, wherever possible, reducing unnecessary workload, ensuring supervision and reflective spaces exist, and that they're safe spaces as well for staff to be able to let go and let off steam and talk about their experiences that they've been finding difficult. And really acknowledging that emotional labour involved in working with children with SEND, pastoral work. Staff need to have permission to feel the difficulty of that work without feeling that they're failing, that actually we're all here to support you. And that's okay. You're not a failure. It's a really, really challenging task, and it's totally normal to feel overloaded and feel sort of drained and fatigued from that. But I think at the same time, leaders need to continue advocating for systematic change. Compassion fatigue is often worse when professionals feel that they're isolated or that they're powerless. So collaboration across schools, local authorities, professional networks, it can help sustain morale and momentum and feel like perhaps we are working towards change and working towards a better way of supporting children.
And that really fits in with a lot of your writing about inclusion not being bolt on, but a real reflection of values, doesn't it? And the ethos of the school. And what does that values-led leadership actually look like for children and the day-to-day decisions around staffing, timetabling, and curriculum design?
So, value-led leadership becomes visible in everyday operational decisions. It's reflected in what schools prioritise when resources are really stretched, which they quite often are. So, for example, staffing decisions communicate values really, really clearly. Do schools deploy experienced staff to support children that have got additional needs? Or is it left to the less experienced, newer staff to the school? Is inclusion delegated to those staff that maybe haven't got the most experience? Are pastoral and communication roles protected? Or is there an increasing pressure for those leaders, although within the school, those middle leaders, to take on more roles in addition to what they're doing as well? Timetabling matters. So does the timetable allow for intervention without children repeatedly missing the same curriculum areas? And quite often these are curriculum areas that some of these children would really thrive in, sort of the more creative and the more hands-on subjects. So is there protective time for play, for regulation, for supporting the development of relationships? Are transitions within the day carefully considered for children who really struggle with change as well? So quite often lunch times and things, how is that managed? How are we making sure that we're really valuing what the children need in the wider school as they move around it? Curriculum design, it's another area. So a values-led curriculum prioritises inclusion, not just about how to access content, but how to access belonging and participation and success. My own daughter, quite often, my own daughter has autism, and she was quite often at school sort of put in a different room and not with the other children. And yes, she did need additional support in many areas, but she didn't feel like she was part of that class for lots of things. So how are we making sure that our classrooms, our year groups, reflect the wider society and they are inclusive, and we've got everybody and everybody is celebrated for their differences and included? I think ultimately values-led leadership asks, who might this decision unintentionally exclude? And quite often that's something that we overlook as leaders, and it's a really important one.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And if we take our conversation back to that initial cohort, the one you entitled the COVID babies, um, What questions should leaders be asking now to avoid repeating mistakes of delayed support and reactive intervention that sort of like you've highlighted through our conversation?
I think leaders need to ask whether the current systems are responsive to emerging needs and not just to identified needs. So, questions that leaders might ask include: are we monitoring developmental trends as children move through those transitional periods through Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2? Are speech, language, and communication needs being identified early enough? Are we taking enough time to not worry too much about the reception baseline? I know we need to do it, we've got to do it, but also to actually be with the children, to actually get on the floor, to play with them, and to observe them in play so that we can identify any potential needs there. Are staff trained to recognise developmental differences that might not fit traditional SEND profiles? And are transition points increasing that vulnerability as well? I think a big thing that's changed my practice has been, as my daughter has moved through the system as a child with SEND, is making sure that families feel listened to and supported to as well. I don't think I realised just how important that was until I didn't feel like I was being listened to as a parent. And that's absolutely crucial. We can't support the child if we're not including the family within that. Thinking about if interventions are flexible enough for children whose needs might emerge slightly later. And I think perhaps most importantly, leaders need to ask whether schools are creating environments where children can succeed before difficulties escalate. Reactive systems often wait until the child fails, and quite often we're asked to gather evidence that the child can't do this over a significant period of time, whereas actually we need to be creating environments that actually allow the child to succeed and support them before they fail.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've seen quite a wide range of educational provision across early years and primary settings. And can you give some examples of maybe hopeful, effective leadership that you've seen that maybe our listeners might be able to learn from?
Yes, so there are so many examples of fantastic practice. I see schools protecting play-based pedagogy beyond reception. I spoke earlier about a school that I went to that have playful learning up to year 3, and they're planning next year to roll that out to year 4, then year 5, year 6, which is wonderful. I see settings redesigning year 1 and year 2 environments to better reflect developmental needs, and leaders really investing in communication friendly classrooms, nurturing approaches, and really thinking about developing relationships and making spaces where children can develop their speech and language skills rather than sort of having education or something done to them and they're quite passive and just sitting there. I think the most effective leaders are strengthening collaboration between early years, between SEND and pastoral teams, rather than treating them as separate strands of provision. Others are working closely with families to build trust and shared understanding, particularly where parents themselves have experienced isolation, either through their own lived experiences or through the pandemic years. What stands out most is not necessarily sort of large scale innovation, but leadership that's thoughtful, it's reflective, it's child centred. The schools making that greatest difference are often those willing to slow down rather than hit the ground running and sort of see it as a sprint. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So those that are slowing down to truly understand the children that are in front of them at the moment.
Now, there are a lot of changes in the education system for early years and beyond. And as we draw our conversation to a close, if you had the ear of school or system leaders nationally at this time, what one mindset shift would you urge them to make to ensure this cohort of children is supported rather than being forgotten?
So I would urge leaders to move away from asking, how can we catch children up? How can we fill these gaps? And instead ask, what developmental experiences did these children miss? And how do we thoughtfully rebuild those? that shift really matters because it reframes children not as problems that we need to accelerate through, but actually as individuals that have been shaped by really extraordinary circumstances. The pandemic didn't just interrupt education. For many children, it really altered the foundations of early development, of socialisation and of support. I recently had a really interesting chat with Bridget Phillipson where I sort of put my point across, and she listened, she made notes, and she sort of nodded in the right places and things, and agreed that we need to be making sure that these children are being identified, they're with us right at this moment, and their needs need to be met. I think if we continue to juggle this cohort only against if we continue to judge the cohort that we've got currently against pre-pandemic expectations without recognising those differences, children's experiences, they didn't choose this. If the system, it needs to be more flexible. It needs to be thinking about how we can use evidence to make sure that we're informed so that we're meeting the children where they are.
Michelle, thank you so much. It's been a really thoughtful and honest and really grounded conversation. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've really reminded us that leadership in inclusion is not about having all of the answers, but it's about noticing early, listening carefully and acting bravely, even when systems feel really quite slow to respond. Now, your work challenges leaders to hold on to that professional integrity, to really resist deficit narratives, and to remember that behind every data point, there is a child whose early experiences really do matter. Thank you so much for your advocacy, your clarity, and your continued challenge to the sector.
Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning into the ISA podcast, Independently Speaking. If you found today's conversation valuable, please do subscribe and share it with colleagues. Join us next time as we continue to explore how independent school leaders can navigate complexity with courage, compassion, and with purpose. Until then, stay curious, stay connected.
You've been listening to Independently Speaking, the podcast of the Independent Schools Association. For more information about ISA and the schools we support, please visit isaschools.org.uk.